So this is Unit 2, Module 3, Lesson 2, User-Initiated List Iteration. So the last lesson we talked about how to set up a list. And essentially all we did was copy all the information from the list into one note box and not do anything else with it. That's not very useful. More often than not, you want to be able to go through that list item by item. Maybe you are keeping track of something and you want to search for a piece of information, or you want to go through and kind of have it iterate back to you one item at a time what's on your list. But you don't normally take the entire list as a total. Normally it's one thing at a time. So what we have to do is talk about how do you progress through a list? How do you get to each individual item in the list rather than the entire list? To do this, we're going to look at an app that is created. It's just an app that goes through and switches pictures, which would be kind of common to do, to be able to go through and as you hit the next button, you go from picture to picture to picture and kind of runs through a series of slides, so to speak. So we have two buttons on here, a back button and a next button, and we have a background. So that's it, a horizontal arrangement putting the two buttons together. But that is essentially all the components you would need in the designer to make this happen. Everything else happens within code. Now you can set up the original background picture. You do need to put some media in. You'll have to have a series of pictures. You'll see that I have 3 pictures here. That's it. You can put any pictures you want into this. There's no limit on the pictures that you have. Again, we're just doing this to kind of understand the mechanics of it. So we have our media. The one thing that's important in your media is that you notice here it lists the files, but it kind of in the middle puts this ... So you really can't see the title. It's important to have the exact title of the images in code. So that way, when you put it in the list and you manipulate the list, you have the names of the files correct. So I make a copy of the names of my images and store it somewhere. Notepad is a very useful place to temporarily store information. So that way when I copy it into my code, I can use the exact title. The ... part won't work. You can't just put ynum ... oh bad. That won't work. It has to be ynumbers so bad .png. You need the full title. So when you're picking your images to upload, you want to make sure that you copy the name of the image, including the extension. So one way to do that is if you right-click on the image and click Rename, that gives you access to the full title, and you can just copy the title. Don't rename it, just copy the title, and paste it into some Notepad document. So you have that handy when you go ahead and start doing some of the code. So once you have that set up, you've uploaded your media, you have all your titles. We want to be able to use a processing list, but App Inventor has built in a way to do that, and it does it with a for loop. A for loop is when you go through an iteration or a repeat a specific number of times. In this case, the specific number of times is going to be the size of the list. So we know how big the list is, or at least App Inventor does, and we're going to tell App Inventor to do something for each element in the list. So we make that happen. Oops. Copy this down here. Is we first create our list when we initialize our program, and we have to put in the names of our pictures. Now, when you click and make a list, it normally only gives you one block. To get multiple blocks, what you do is you click on the little blue square part, and then you're able to add in more items to your list over and over and over again. We're only going to add in 3 pictures. Then we're also going to initialize an index. So let's take a look at our next button. What does that actually do? Well, the index keeps track of which image we're on. An index in a lot of computer languages indexes starting at 0. So if I have 5 items, in most computer languages, it would count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. For some reason, App Inventor doesn't do that. They start counting at 1. This is different than any other language I've ever seen. Any other language starts counting at 0, but for some reason, App Inventor starts counting at 1. So we start at 1. If our global index is less than the length of our image files, so we're not at the end of our list. Essentially, that's what's checking. Is our current position, which is 1, smaller than the length of the list? Yes, it is. What we're going to do is set the global index to the global index plus 1. We're going to increment the list. We're going to go 1 index further. So we're going to go from 1 to 2. And we're going to set the image picture, the background, to the selected item from the list, which is indexed by this global index. So we want the list global image files. That's this list up here. We want this list called global image files, and we want the current index, which is indexed 2 at this point. And it's going to set the background picture to that image. So every time I hit the next button, it's going to move forward. So the next question, of course, is how do you add a previous button to make the slideshow go backwards? So what we want to do a previous button is we want to check to see if the global index is greater than 1. First, we don't want to go backwards off the list. If we go backwards off the list, it causes an error in the program. Most often, that error is entitled index out of bounds. And you'll see a little red flag come up, but the problem is it's a compiler error. In other words, your program will run, but then it's going to break down. So if you're running this inside of an emulator, some error is going to pop up on the screen if you go to previous and that item doesn't exist. We haven't had a runtime error yet. This is really the first time we've talked about something that could cause a runtime error, where the app just stops working. So if you're playing with an app and for some reason it stopped working, that's not a compiler error. You didn't type anything wrong. You're doing something wrong. In other words, you're asking the computer to do something it's not able to, like count -1 items. Right? The computer can't count in a list -1 items. It doesn't have that ability to do that. It can't divide by 0. That's another thing it can't do. Mathematically, it doesn't exist. So if you ask it to do that, it's going to throw up an error, and your app is going to crash. In Android, most often what happens in that case is the app just shuts off. You don't see an error. So unfortunately, there's really no great error checking built into your regular Android phone. I'm not sure if the Knox emulator has error checking in that or not. You could check when you do this to try to put in greater than -5, just to see if you could cause the error, and how does Knox behave when that error happens. Will it shut down the app and not give you any information? Or will it shut down the app and then tell you, hey, wait, index out of bounds? That's what you're really looking for, to see what kind of information that Knox will give you, or any other emulator that you're using. Is it going to give you some type of information? There might be a debug mode you could get into to take a look at, so that might be worth playing around with in this particular app. So once we've checked our index is greater than 1, next we want to do is subtract 1 from the current index. And then we're going to set the background picture, just like we did before, to the current index. So previous makes us go backwards. So how do you make it loop back to front? Well, we talked about that. We would need an else condition in both our previous and our next. So our previous button, if we were less than 1, we would have to set our condition back to the end of the list. make our index jump from being index of 1 to index of end of list. And for our next condition, make our index jump from the end of the list back to 1. So we'd have to put our else conditions in. So that looks something like this. When we click our next button, if the global index is less than the length of the list, then we do what we did before, set the global index. Otherwise, we set the global index to 1. Note that we do still put the picture into the background, and that happens in either case. So we want this part of the code to be outside the if statement. The if statement is just testing to see, are we at some point in the list, or have we gotten to the beginning of the end of the list, and we should jump back to the first. Then, no matter where we are, we should update the background picture. There we go. So here's both buttons. If we are at the beginning of the list, that's fine. Notice in this case I have the picture image set inside the if statement. You don't have to do that. You would do it outside the statement. If it's at the beginning, if it's greater than 1, and I'm subtracting 1, then we're okay. But if it's not greater than 1, then what we're going to do is set the global index to the length of the list. Now again, this is really important to note. In every other computer science language, they don't count this way. In every other computer science language, if you have 5 items in a list, it counts 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. In App Inventor, if you have 5 items in a list, it's indexed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know why they did that. It really shouldn't be that way, so that way you learn how every other computer language works, but that's the way it is. So be aware that if we were doing this in another language, we wouldn't set it equal to the length of the list. We would set it equal to the length of the list minus 1. Because it gets indexed 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in any other language. In App Inventor, it starts at indexing at 1. But every other language starts indexing at 0. So what I want you guys to do is go into App Inventor and create this app. From scratch, you can use, this is the design view you should have. Let me move this screen a little bit. So this is the design view you should have, and these are the blocks you should have, naming your own files inside of the image. So you can pause back and forth at the end of this video to see that code so you can make the app. When you're all done, you're going to go into Unit 2, Module 3, Lesson 2, List Iterations, and add your AIA and your APK.